Welcome to another lesson of the Beginner's Guide to DXCP course. I'm Marcelo Lewin, the Headless Creator. As always, you can get a hold of me, Marcelo, at headlesscreator.com. Now, today's lesson from Headless 1.0 to Headless 2.0, presented by Adam Kahn, VP of Enablement at Uniform. We're going to explore the differences between 1.0 and 2.0. We'll actually learn what is 2.0. And also we're going to figure out how does the workflows and productivity for developers and authors are affected in 1.0 and how those can be streamlined in 2.0. But before we get started, let's go ahead and get Adam in. Adam, welcome.
Hey, Marcelo, it's great to be back.
Glad to have you back. You've been here many times, both on our tutorial series that we offer in all the courses and also on the podcast. So thank you for doing this. Appreciate it. For those that don't know much about you, tell us a little bit about your background before we jump into the presentation.
Yeah, so my background is I've been in technology, especially digital experience technology, for many, many years, probably longer than I like to think of, and have seen kind of the cycles come and go. And they are cycles. And this is something that we'll get into today: the idea of things being developer centric, and then swinging more towards the author, editor, business user persona, and then back again. Seen it a number of times, but I think things are a little different this time around, and that's kind of what the Headless 1.0 and Headless 2.0 kind of gets into.
Well, it's interesting because with Headless, the wonderful thing about it became a really great thing for developers, right? But I think at the beginning, we kind of forgot about the marketers, the authors, and the people that actually use that technology, right? And like you said, now we're kind of shifting towards that to better support those users. And we're not forgetting the developers. We're just making sure that those users are also well supported.
Yeah, because there also have been some things that have kind of come out of this first wave of headless technology that does affect developers. So things can be improved for them as well.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, cool. Well, for those of you watching live, we'll go ahead and put in any questions, and I'll ask Adam. Adam, I'm showing your slides here, so I'm going to let you get started, and I'll come back with questions.
Great. Thanks a lot. So yeah, here we're going to be talking about moving from Headless 1.0 to Headless 2.0 using digital experience composition. So if you're on Headless Creator, you probably know what Headless is. We use the term Headless 1.0 to describe kind of the traditional approach to designing web applications using headless systems. So you have something like a headless CMS or a headless commerce system that provides no functionality for generating or rendering the front end. So a headless CMS, as an example, is a pure content management system. And the content may be web content, or it may be used in mobile applications or email campaigns. And it could even be used in non-digital channels like print campaigns and the things that fill up your mailbox. It's a developer's job to provide the front end. And developers have options. They can build it themselves, use some sort of front end as a service. They might use a pre-built front end. There are these different choices that they can evaluate. And this was really seen as a strength. You can do anything you want with whatever tools or technologies that you want to use. And this also has the very welcome byproduct of having a great developer experience, because if developers can use the things that they're comfortable with, then they're going to be more productive. And a lot of these tools were created by developers, so they know what developers need. It also makes the approach a very developer-centric one. But also that was fine, because a lot of the interest in the headless approach really was the result of this pendulum that I was mentioned at the top, kind of swinging back and forth over the years. And with the emergence of headless technology, the pendulum sort of was swinging prior to the emergence of headless. The pendulum was swinging a little bit too much to the content editors and the authors side of things. And that was how it existed and how it played out in the DXP world, the digital experience platform world. And developers weren't able to deliver the solutions that they needed and to do it in realistic time and within budget constraints. So as this headless approach was adopted, brands were successful really quickly. And that created a lot of excitement and optimism. But this approach, like anything, is a tool. And like any tool, it's great for certain jobs, but it's not great and appropriate for every job. And the cases where this traditional developer-centric headless approach wasn't a great fit, that's what I want to talk about today. Because this traditional approach is like the first version of a product, version 1.0 of a product. If people love the product, there's usually some motivation to improve it and release more versions. And those versions are not completely disconnected from the past. They build on the proven success of earlier versions, and then they add support for more use cases and to target a larger audience. And this is exactly what we're seeing happening with the headless approach. So the evolution of the headless approach is what we can call Headless 2.0. And what it really is a composable approach. And this is where the right tools used for the job and developers and business users are true collaborators. So what I'm suggesting here is that the traditional headless approach doesn't do either of these things. So I'm going to explain why I would say this, and also explain how a composable approach actually does, and how digital experience composition platform, a DXCP, is the key enabling technology here.
Now, real quick question for you, and this is just to have a little conversation around that. But the promise of Headless 1.0 was single source of truth, right? That's when you actually started creating objects of content that you can reuse across the organization. But that meant that authors also had to rethink the way they create content and manage content. But they came from a very legacy system where everything was focused on how it looks. Do you think part of the reason that Headless 1.0 fully didn't work perfectly is because the training of the author still, their mindset was still set on how it looks versus just the content, and let the front end decide how it looks and where it's displayed? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a contributing factor, but I don't think that it's really fair to rest it all on that, because the products, the tools themselves were designed to force them to do that.
Yeah.
And these are some of the things that I'll get into a bit in more detail.
Okay.
But yeah, there were a lot of challenges, and it's really not a criticism of the first iteration.
Yeah, no, and I didn't mean it as a criticism of authors either, but I think part of it is the retraining of that mindset as well.
Yeah, and also just the lack of tools. They weren't given tools that allowed them to think in different ways.
Yep, definitely. Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yep. So the best way that I know to kind of explain and put Headless 2.0 into context is to cover some of the challenges that brands face when they're adopting Headless 1.0 and using that approach. And I've identified kind of three main ones. And for some dramatic effect here, I'm going to reveal them gradually over the course of the session. But the first one is something that we call content pollution. And content pollution, and Marcelo, I actually think that you're the first person I heard use this term, but it's what happens when your content model is stretched beyond what the headless system was designed to handle. And these systems, these headless systems, really serve one purpose. Like a headless CMS manages content. It doesn't know how or where the content's going to be used, and it really doesn't care. But in the real world, this creates a challenge because, and this is, I think, what you just brought up, Marcelo, you don't create content just for the sake of creating content. You create it because it needs to be used somewhere. So these real world requirements end up interfering with or polluting the headless system. And there are a couple of ways that this creates problems. So content model complexity is the first problem. And you might start out with a very pure content model, something like you've got an entity that has a name, description, location, and image. But then as you start supporting specific channels, that's when pollution starts to happen. So you add a little bit of web-specific content, so like maybe a font and image alignment. But then you need to support some other channels, so you add fields for mobile. And then you need to support email, so you add a few more. And the reason why this happens is because there really isn't any place else to put this information. So you end up putting it in your headless content system.
And if I can add, and by the time you're done with that, right now you've actually tied your content model to the look and feel of your site, your email, and all that. So when it's time to redesign and you add new fields, now you're affecting the content model where you're not supposed to, right? The content model is supposed to be on content, not design.
Yeah. But again, you end up putting it there because you don't have an alternative.
Right.
And then to see what this looks like in a real world example. So this is an example from the Contentful starter site. And this represents a call to action. And these are all of the different fields that are in the content type. And I put a green little icon next to the fields that really do make sense in terms of describing the content and what a call to action is. And the fields that are in red represent the things that are kind of added in that are added in because this particular call to action is going to be used on a web page. So you've got things like image style and sizing and color palette. And so those get added in, and this is kind of a visible example of what we're talking about with content pollution. Another problem that we have here is the size of the content model. And this is an issue for practical and financial reasons. So I'm talking about here the number of data types that you need to define in your system. And this is similar to the content model complexity, but in the content model complexity, we were talking about the number of fields. So instead of having a large number of fields in a content type, now we're talking about having a large number of content types themselves. So you start off with content types that represent your data model, and then you need to add more in order to handle the sorts of objects you need to build, say, a web page. Then you add content types that represent components. And a real world site can have a lot of different components. And with some systems, you have to pay for the number of content types you use. So that ends up having a direct consequence on not only the complexity of the system, but also of how much you're paying to use the service. And then here's a real world example, again, using just a content type from sample Contentful space. But in here, we can see that a few of these, and I marked these in green. The ones that are in green are what I feel very clearly belong in a content model. These are content types that describe something in the abstract. But a lot of these don't. So the ones with the red dot next to them, maybe they are, maybe they aren't. In some cases, they're clearly they aren't. Some cases, it's arguable. But again, the reason why they're put in here is really because there's just nowhere else for them to go. And in this simple example, there's only 4 of the 16 content types that are definitely, obviously, clearly needed. So you might be paying for 4 times as many content types as you actually need.
The other way to think about it too is right here, right? When you're looking at creating your content model, is you're looking at this and you're going, if I need to send this content to other systems, for example, I need to share it with Salesforce for customer support, right? To pull information about the business or the person. Does SEO mean anything to Salesforce? Or if I send it to any other system, the CTA component or duplex component or whatever, does it mean anything? No, it means nothing. They don't need it. So then that pollutes that content type, right? Because you're putting stuff that only belongs in one place. And then one day when you say, oh, we don't have, I mean, it's not going to happen, but let's say we don't have the website anymore. SEO means nothing. You don't need it anymore. Whereas that's not the core of the content, right?
Yep, exactly it. So Headless 2, where does that fit in? So Headless 2.0 offers a solution to this. And the solution is to recognize that your content model is distinct from your experience model and to use appropriate tools to manage that. And these tools need to work together, but they aren't the same thing. So in here, we've got a description of what is in the content model and what is in the experience model. Those are the 2 boxes that are in here, kind of the lighter purple and the darker purple. The content model has things like the entities that represent the content and the data. The content that goes into the content model itself, it needs governance, and it's channel agnostic. So it's not tied to the web, or it's not tied to mobile. It's something that kind of transcends all of those different channels. And it also can be used for content that needs to be repurposed, whether it's repurposed across multiple channels or repurposed throughout the single channel. Because to be realistic, a lot of brands are using these headless systems just for the web. So that doesn't mean that just because you're only using one channel that everything needs to be mixed together, but by having content in the headless system, it makes it a lot easier for it to be repurposed throughout even the same channel. And an example of where a content model would be defined and stored is in the headless CMS or a headless commerce system. Now that stands in contrast to the experience model. And in the experience model, you would expect to find things like the entities that represent experience elements. So things like components that build up a digital experience. If you've got a website and maybe you're building in React, you've got React components. So some sort of a representation of an element that builds up an experience. Ad hoc content is another. So something that you create that needs to just be in there quickly. Maybe you're testing it or testing it around. You don't really need to go through all of the rigor and the governance that you have in the content system. You just want something to include, on a web page or in an email message. You just want to get it out there quickly. This is another place because it allows you to keep that content, that data, closely tied to the experience, the channel that it's going to be delivered on. Also, channel-specific content. This is one of the easiest things to demonstrate or to explain. This is like button text or positioning for elements, things that describe the content that is coming from the content model, but it is not describing the actual content itself. It's describing how the content is being used. And also single-use content here. So if it's just something that you need to only use once in one place, that can be used in the experience model. And the place where the experience model is created and managed and maintained and used is what the digital experience platform, the DXCP, is. So I want to go in and take a look at what this looks like in a DXCP to give you a sense of what does it look like to be working with an experience model as opposed to working inside of a headless CMS or a headless system. So I'm looking at Uniform. Uniform is a DXCP, but Uniform isn't the only one out there. But this is the one that I'm going to be using as an example. So what I want to do is I want to create a new page, go through the experience of creating a new page and adding a component onto the page that pulls in some content from my headless CMS. So that'll give me a chance to see what is the content that's coming from the headless CMS and what is the content, the experience content. So in here, I'm going to add in a new page, and I'm going to just call this Headless Creator Day. It's going to be a composition. I'm going to create a page, and I'm going to open this in Canvas. So Canvas is a visual composition tool. This is allowing you to visually build your experience. Okay, so you're not creating the content. The content has already been created in the content system, but we want to use that to create a page. Now, this is a page that is inheriting from a global template. So it'll have a header and a footer on it when it's deployed. But in order to focus my attention as an author, I'm not seeing the header and the footer because that's set for me. I'm just going to be focusing on page content. And in here, I'm going to add in some page content. And I've got these different components. So this is an example of some of the content, some of the stuff that is defined in an experience model. The definition of the different components that are available. These are the building blocks for your experience. The experience in this case, again, is a web page. So the component that I want to use is a contentful hero. And I'm going to select the contentful hero. And what this does is it adds the component onto the page. And then over on the right-hand side here, it shows me the experience data that I can set. So this is a hero component. So I'm able to change the display variant. I'm able to change the data. The data in this case is coming from Contentful. So if I click select, this is going to give me a view into Contentful. This has already been set up because the developers know what is this hero component, what is the appropriate content from the CMS that could be fed into this particular type of component, and has this all set up. So I'm able to come in here, I'll pick point black. This shows me the content that I've selected, the content entry. I'll save this. And now it shows me what that content looks like. Now, the display variant I mentioned earlier. So the display variant is something that is not tied to the content itself. The content itself just has like the image and the text. But how I want to display this, if I want the image on the left, or I want the image on the right, or I want the image to be in the background, that's the display variant. So that's something that is experience data. It doesn't belong in the CMS, but in Headless 1.0, it was often put in the CMS because that's the only place that you can do it. With the DXCP, now you've got another place to store that experience data. There is a title. The title was brought in from the CMS. So this was bound to this particular parameter on the component. So we have a title, and based on the rules that are set up in the DXCP, I might be able to overwrite this, or I might not. In this case, it's set up to allow me to override it. So it's getting the value from the CMS, but if I don't want the value from the CMS, I can get rid of that. But the description is not. So the description is a sample credit card. So this is an example of kind of that ad hoc content, or that content that might be very temporary, or might be something that we're testing out. It's not coming from the CMS. It's something that is going to be incorporated directly into the component, into the experience. So I've got the ability to edit this directly through the DXCP. And then the image. The image is like the title text. It comes from the Headless CMS. So if I, just as an example here, if I edit the content, this will allow me to change the value. So I'll change this over to the corporate coin, save this, and now it gets updated. And that title and the image were automatically changed. So this gives me the ability to use that content and that information from the CMS, but use it to build an experience. And this gives me that separation between what is the content model and what is the experience model.
And really important, I think this, your presentation is emphasizing this, but like, for example, you have the primary button style. That means nothing to where you got the content from, right? It means on the content side, it means nothing because we're not going to send that value to another place. And if you then push this to mobile, you may not even have the button style, let's say, because on mobile you use something else. And that's where you're keeping that, you're avoiding that pollution, right? Because you're not adding all of that stuff to the content model itself. And then when you send the content to Salesforce, we're not sending the button style because they don't need that.
Exactly. And I think another example of this that might bring it home for some people is the idea of what happens when you're using multiple headless systems.
Right.
And you've got the ability to store things like styles and button copy in multiple places. Imagine this is a component that's pulling some content from the Headless CMS, but is also pulling content from a PIM. You can do that with a DXCP without having to figure out, well, do I want to bring everything into the Headless CMS and then have the Headless CMS manage all of this? Or do I put it in the PIM? You don't need to put it in either, because the right place for it is experience data. It doesn't go in either of those. It goes into this system, the DXCP.
Yep.
Okay, so this is that's just the real world example. Okay, so our next challenge is a challenge that's called glue code. And one of the big promises of the headless approach was that you wouldn't be tied to a single monolithic CMS or DXP or commerce system. But what happened instead is that you're tied to a headless system. And that's definitely an improvement for a ton of reasons that I think are very well known and appreciated to people who are interested in the headless approach. But this does have some downsides. So how does this reduce developer agility? And this is something that you've always had to do, writing some code. So at some point, you need to write the code that connects to other systems. But the question here really is, what is that point? And application logic and component implementations definitely need to be developed. And there are cases where calls to external systems are needed, but there's a lot of cases where it's not. So does data access logic need to be there? Do you need references to all the different SDKs for all the systems that you integrate with? What about the logic that binds data to specific components? So this is all stuff that wasn't immediately apparent in the Headless 1.0 world because you weren't dealing with a lot of different systems. You started with your Headless CMS and okay, you're building an application, you've got one data source, you use the SDK, it's easy enough to write your GraphQL queries or whatever it is you need to use and you're on your way. But where it started becoming apparent that it was a little bit of a problem is once you start adding more and more systems. And every new system you add, you need to learn a new SDK. You need to incorporate that into your application. And this is the stuff that we call glue code because it makes those external systems sticky, both in the sense that they're hard to remove in the future if your requirements or your budget changes, but also in the sense that you're stuck with a lot of code that you need to maintain that does really routine tasks. Like data access logic is not hard to write, but it can be tedious to write. And you have to learn new APIs and you have to maintain that code and you have to keep up with API changes. So it can be tedious to maintain. And all that time that developers are spending kind of writing and maintaining that code is time that they could be spending on other projects that are much more higher value and honestly are more interesting to developers than just writing code that runs a GraphQL query that gets some data back and then binds that data to a prop on a component. And kind of the threat and the damage that glue code poses is real and serious. And at Uniform, we describe this in terms of a fight with a monster. So we've got this glue code monster and we are urging people to fight it. So we've got stickers of this guy, we call him Gludo. So if you're interested, reach out and we can talk about that. So this is the issue and the challenge that emerged from Headless 1.0. How does Headless 2.0 address this? You really need to decouple the data access logic from the front-end application in order to reduce the amount of code that you need to maintain and simplify the process of adding new systems. And in here, we've got kind of the breakdown of this in terms of development and configuration. What should be development tasks and what should be configuration tasks through the lens of Headless 2.0. So development tasks are things like component implementations and component orchestration, application logic. That's handled in the front-end application itself. The data source definitions and the data orchestration and the data access and mapping data to components, those are things that don't need to be done in code anymore. They can be handled in the digital experience composition platform. So for this, I'm going to switch back over and show you what this looks like in the DXCP. And the example here that I want to do is kind of revisit this idea of a hero, because we've got this hero and we've already seen, or I've already showed you how we're able to use a component that's already been bound to a content source. That's what's happening here when I'm changing from one entry from Contentful to another. Okay, but how is that set up and how is the data mapping done? And what I want to do as an example here is I want to show you how I can wire up the same front-end component, the same hero component, to another headless CMS without using any code, without having to write any code, and also to set this up so that the business user or the content author is able to take advantage of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just save this, and I'm going to go back into my components, and I'm going to find my hero component. Just do a search here and go into the hero component. And in the hero component, I've already got it here. Let me just delete this really quickly because that's what I want to create. So we've got in here already one pattern, and the pattern is basically the component, in this case, this is a representation of the front-end component called a hero, that is pre-configured to be bound to a data source or multiple data sources in some way. I've already got one for Contentful. That's the one that I've already used. And if I come in here, I can see that, for example, the title is bound into the field called name. And I can see that for the image is bound to a field called featured image, and it's a URL on the featured image. So this is not something that a content author would generally set up. A developer probably would, but a technical business user, a technical author could. What I want to do is I want to add a new pattern, but this is going to be going to a different headless CMS. So let's say that I'm a big organization and I actually have multiple headless CMSs. I've got one business unit that uses Contentful. I've got another business unit that uses Content Stack. So I'm going to go into my data types, and I can see that I've already got this configured with Content Stack, and I've got a single block entry defined. So what a single block entry is, if I come into here, it's going to use a connection that's already been set up. So I've got this data source called Content Stack. The data source itself is where the credentials for that connection are configured. Okay, so this is normally stuff that goes in code, but I've got my region, stack ID, and delivery token. Those get configured, and now I'm able to use that to define these filters that will be used for binding content from Content Stack into my hero component in this case. So what this is doing is it's limiting us to just blog entries. And there are other settings in here that allow me to control different facets of how this information from Content Stack is going to be exposed to the author. But I have this single blog entry. So what I can do is I'm going to go back into my hero component. And in my patterns, I'm going to add in a new pattern. And I'll call this the Content Stack hero. Create this. And now go into data resources because I want to bind this to one of those connections that I just showed you. So I'm going to come in here. My data type is going to be the single blog entry from Content Stack. And now I am able to select an entry, and this entry is just for configuring the mapping, the data mapping. So it doesn't really matter which one I pick. I'll pick the future of business with AI and save that. And now I've got a resource. I'm going to come back over here, and this is the definition of a hero component. And the hero has these different fields in it. And some of these fields may come from the CMS. Some of them may come from the experience itself. The front-end component doesn't care, but this is what we're doing in the DXCP. So what I want to do is I'm going to select eyebrow text, or I'm going to select title, because I want to bind the title over to that single blog entry. This is giving me a view into the content model in my headless CMS. So what I want to pick here is I want to pick the title and connect that. And notice now it fills in the value of title. I'm also going to fill in the image. So in here, I'm going to look for the featured image. And under the featured image, there is a URL. So I'm going to connect that. And now I've got the image. I could bind other parameters if I want, but I don't need to in this case. Something else I'm going to set though is I'm going to set by default, I want the display variant to be image left. So this is not coming from the headless CMS, but this is just me setting it up so that the author doesn't have to change it to image left, because I'm anticipating that most of the time they're going to want the image to be on the left. The other bit of control that I'm able to have, and this is through the DXCP, is overrides. So I'm setting up this example of what a Content Stack hero is. If I go into overrides, what do I want the author to be able to change? So I want them to be able to change the variant. I want them to be able to change the data source from Content Stack. And I also want them to be able to change all of these other parameters. So I'm going to enable those. But maybe I don't want them to change the title or the image, because those are coming from the headless CMS. In the Contentful example, I was able to, but in this example, I don't want them to be able to do that. So I can deny that functionality. I'm going to save this. And then I'm going to go back to that page that I was creating. So I'll go back to the project map and return to my Headless Creator day. And I've got this component on here already. I'm going to add my new component underneath it. So I'm going to just add this component in here. And I'm going to look for content stack. And here's my content stack hero. So I'm going to pick that. Now I've got this component. Just like I had with Contentful, I can select the blog entry, and maybe I want for this particular page to use robotics. Save this. Now I've got my text and my image. Display variant is set to image left. I do not have the ability to change the title, but I can still put in my description.
Now, as you're doing that, I want to point out this is pretty powerful, right? Because in Headless 1.0, what all of this would be hard coded on the front end of the page. You would have to pull from content stack, from Contentful, the data, right? All on the front end. Here, the author is empowered, which I know is your next bullet point of talking about the autonomy, right, of content marketers and stuff. But here, the author is empowered to do that. And then you can also focus on what's stored in which system, right? So you can have single source of truth of certain kind of content in content stack, let's say, in an organization that has multiple CMSs, and other kinds of content in Contentful, and then the author merges it all together here.
Exactly.
Cool.
Okay, so now I'll return back over to the slides. And for this, am I back on the slides? Oh, there we go. Okay. So then the next and last challenge that I want to talk about is developer dependency. And authors and other business users are really at the mercy of the development team's backlog. And this is just a natural consequence of the Headless 1.0 approach being very developer-centric. And the result is that the business users lose their agility, and the kinds of tools and capabilities non-developers are used to having from the previous systems that they were using, like the DXPs and the monolithic CMSs, those aren't available. So then they have to ask developers to do this work, which really reduces the ability for these business teams to be able to execute quickly. And to use Headless CMS as an example again, business teams are empowered to manage content, but their autonomy when it comes to building experiences that use that content is significantly reduced at best, and sometimes is eliminated entirely. With Headless 2.0, we take advantage of tools to offload work from developers and to empower business users. And this involves embracing composability and leveraging the benefits of being able to use kind of these best of need products. So the products that have the features that you need, not the products that somebody else has said is just, this is the best that there is out there. And also it involves embracing the fact that developers and non-developers are really equal participants in building digital experiences. So I'm going to go back over to the demo and just talk through a couple of things quickly here. Visual composition is a big one. We've seen this already, but it is important to note that in a DXCP, digital experience composition platform, visual composition is possible for multiple channels. I'm not showing multiple channels here. This is just a web page, but I actually did another session with you, Marcelo, a little while back on how we can use a DXCP to manage experiences on other channels. We used you call it the A-Lady device. I don't have one on, so I guess I can say an Alexa device to build an experience, a personalized experience using a DXCP for that channel. But also with multiple systems, and we've seen multiple systems here. And even though this is a little bit of a contrived example, having two headless CMSs, it's actually not as unusual as you might think. But replace one of these headless CMSs with a commerce system and with a DAM, and you can, I think, pretty quickly start to think of all of the different kinds of systems that you would like to be able to allow authors to be able to build experiences with, but to do it in this kind of a controlled way. But what's important to note, and I didn't call this out before, but I do want to call it out now, is this is being done with making no code changes. When I wired up this content stack component, I didn't change any code. I didn't have to go into the front end application and make any changes at all. So the front end application was already set up. We did some configuration, but this is the difference between coding, development, and configuration. And it's one of the big differences between Headless 1.0 and Headless 2.0. With Headless 1.0, you are okay with developing large parts of the application. With Headless 2.0, we want to refactor and decouple as much of that as we can, destroy the glue code, and really bring this functionality into configuration where it can be managed by non-developers, and to re-empower the business users. We've got some other capabilities too, and just to give you a sense of the sorts of things that you should expect from a digital experience platform, things like building out site maps or project maps, having a visual representation of the relationships between the pages or the screens or the parts of a digital experience. I showed this a little bit by adding in a new page to the website, but it also can be used for managing the things that I just mentioned, so screens and sections of applications. And then we also have things like redirect management, and redirects are an important part of a digital experience, because if you're building campaigns and you're changing URLs around and you're moving things around, you want the people who understand what the URLs and what the changes are to be able to have some control over that, and to not have to send requests over to developers and have developers make changes to a CDN in order for redirects to be working. So this is more functionality that can be passed back over to business users in order to keep them empowered and allow them to execute quickly. Okay, so with that, I'm going to just head right back over to the slides and pick this up. So that gets us through these three challenges of Headless 1.0. And hopefully this has given you some insight into how a DXCP provides a path from Headless 1.0 to Headless 2.0. It's really more of a path to composability than anything else. And composability is all about using the right tool for the right job and making sure that technical teams and non-technical teams are working together as efficiently and as effectively as possible.
So real quick on like when you were saying about the redirects, I mean, that's a perfect example of empowering authors to do that, right? Or maybe it's more technical people that may do that, but not developers. You don't have to do it, right? You just create that redirect, where in most headless CMSs, I believe even up to today, you don't have that functionality there. That's usually, like you mentioned, handled by a developer. So we're kind of seeing that approach coming back, right? Where you have the developer side, you have the content author side, and then you have the sort of that in between, where it could be a little bit more of a technical but business user, not so much the developer handling that, right? Because that can speed up the process of getting to market quickly on changes.
Yeah, it can, and the for some of this configuration, like the mapping of data sources to components, that might be kind of beyond the reach of an average author. But the average marketer being able to come in and configure redirects, that is something that is realistic and is something that they do think about often when they want to change a URL or they're creating a new promotion. They need to be able to come in and create vanity URLs. This allows them to do that within the same tool that they're using to build these experiences.
Yep, definitely. Well, Adam, that was great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you presenting here today. If people want to get a hold of you or find out more, best way besides going to uniform.dev, any other way?
Yeah, I'm still on Twitter a little bit and LinkedIn. On Twitter, I'm Adam_PDX and Adam Khan on LinkedIn. So I look forward to talking with the audience.
That was awesome. Thank you so much, Adam. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Marcelo.
And thanks to the rest of you. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Stay tuned for many more episodes coming soon. And as always, go check out headlesscreator.com and send me an email, marcelo@headlesscreator.com, if you have any questions. So we will see you on the next one. Cheers, everybody.